All right. I want to welcome everyone. I'm Zach Duke, CEO of FInosec. We had several folks in the waiting room, and we're right at time to get started. So I'm going to give everyone just a little bit of time. A couple of logistics as we have our conversations and discussions today. So first off, my goal is to keep you entertained. So if you're eating your lunch and you are in that process, I want to be able to maybe make you chuckle and laugh a couple of times. So be prepared for some awkward dad jokes. Additionally, as part of this process, for those of you who have seen me present, I am completely fine with the heckling. You're allowed to, expected. All those things are completely okay. You can do that through the chat. So the chat is going to be open as we have our conversations today. Additionally, you have the opportunity, if you're like me, you can use the chat to ask questions as we go through today. So I typically, if I don't write it down or ask the question when it comes up, I'll tend to forget. So feel free to do that. If I see the question as I'm going through, I will try to respond. But if I miss it, I will make sure that we do that at the end of the presentation as a worst case. So the goal today is really talking about budgeting, best practices, what to expect when you go through the process, and some things that we've learned, and I've learned personally just as I've went through this process. So to get started, I really want to kind of level set, and we're going to talk through the common challenges. We're going to talk about communicating upward and just the challenges in a community bank when you have your conversations and discussions and what that looks like. I've got some questions to ask and maybe questions to answer as part of that. And ultimately, I want to leave you with some best practices and some key takeaways. So the first piece here is I want to level set on the cyber concern. And I think this is really important to understand. So this is from the community the Conference of State Bank Supervisors, and they have a community bank sentiment. So if you're not familiar with the community or the Conference of State Bank Supervisors, it's almost like a user group for the state regulators. And I am so corny. I would so love to go to their conference and be able to be at cocktail hour or be a fly on the wall just for the conversations that happen. But just think of that as like a regulator user group. One of the things they do that's really cool, and this is a great resource for you, is they do a community bank sentiment index or a survey. They do it actually every quarter. And what we've seen is we see these trends. So essentially, as it goes over 100, it kind of less than 100 is negative, over 100 is positive. So you can see the trends really when you're thinking about going and talking to your leadership. Their trend has been high and has been for several quarters in a row. However, cyber risk has been the number one concern every year since 2018. And 93% of the folks that actually replied to this sentiment index referenced cyber as critical. Now, usually what we see is the executive leaders are the folks that are filling this information out. And when you think about leadership at your institution, one of the challenges that we see is a lot of times they have not come up through the IT and the operational side of the institution. A lot of times the CEO and the president have been in a lending role, and it's not uncommon for that to be the case. So it creates some unique challenges where they're really concerned about it, but there's a dynamic or a challenge in the communication from the folks that are actually doing the work and being able to actually be responsible for the oversight. So I like to start with this because it kind of helps level set what we're seeing trend-wise as you start your process of being able to go kind of prepare your budget and the scenarios as you go through. As part of this, we also have seen this kind of increased components. I like to talk about this as really kind of the four truths. And these first two items you're going to hear as we talk through today. First, around the regulatory expectations continuing to expand, and at the same time, the increased sophistication of cyber attacks. These two things, as we think through the process, so when you think about the regulatory expectations, we'll talk through the details of some examples that we're seeing, as well as on cyber risk. today as we spend some time together. But these two things spread the typical community bank crazy thin. And you're not like a Bank of America or a Wells Fargo where you have a floor of people that are doing these things. And in a lot of ways, we get handcuffed by our legacy systems and our legacy processes. It creates unique challenges for us. So as we talk through today, I'm going to go through each of these and kind of give you some examples of kind of the trends associated. The first is just on the regulatory challenges. So if you're not up to speed on the third-party risk management guidance that came out as a joint piece from the FDIC, OCC, and the Federal Reserve, it really changed the game on the expectations of due diligence, the planning process, your ongoing monitoring, and even your termination processes. These are the 5 steps that they've really kind of outlined. But because of the expectations that have changed, there are significant things that now have to happen both in your vendor review process as well as your documentation of overall risk. So understanding these pieces and the expectations becomes a landing spot to understand how do your processes internally match up to the expectations. Now, as you're thinking about the communication to your team and we're thinking about these increasing risks, it's just important for them to understand that third-party risk management expectations have changed. And that's created new expectations of how we have to manage things internally. That's really the overarching piece that we want to be able to talk through with them. The regulators have actually given us some really good resources to be able to go talk through that. There's a community banking guide. Happy to, as we go through today, if you want to have links to this information, I'm happy to share it. Also, as part of this, at the end of the presentation today, you'll be able to get a recording of this. And the goal is for you to be able to kind of use these resources and processes as you have conversations internally. But there's no doubt that third-party risk management, or if you want to sound really smart, call it TPRM. You know how you have to do abbreviations and acronyms in our world. Then you're officially at the cool kids table where you're able to go through and have the expectations. Additionally, we've seen this with authentication guidance. This expectation actually goes all the way back to 2021, but we're seeing trends with findings. This is actually a finding from a little less than $500 million community bank in Texas. The specific pieces they had for user access reviews is they actually went through. Now, this is a formal action. So this is not a verbal recommendation. This is not even a finding that is written. This is a dynamic where there is a memorandum of understanding where the institution actually has to respond to this and put processes in place. And I use this because it gives you the meat and potatoes to show your team of the expectations that have changed specifically with the regulators around access management. And as part of this, one of the things I've got highlighted is they talk about bank systems to be reviewed. They talk about a number of items associated: core network, internet banking, debit card, APIs. Furthermore, they talk about the expectation that they should be reviewed at least quarterly. So it sets this expectation of how we need to do user access reviews. As you think about your processes internally, this is part of where you're getting the meat and potatoes of what kind of the regulatory world and those expectations. We've also seen this trend where, and just a little bit on the FInosec side, we've got a little over 230 customers. One of the things that we've been doing is having a consistent and repeatable process to be able to actually get exam and audit feedback from our customers. So one of the things that we've seen as a trend, this happened about 2 years ago, where all of a sudden examiners and auditors were wanting a PII assessment by system. And they want to know which systems, not just what vendors, but what actual systems have PII, what the types of the data is. Every new system, they want you to go through that same process. And we're seeing this recommendation. Now, really what the process then creates is really, hey, how do I go address this? What is that process? That's when you think about this regulatory change dynamic, we've got to kind of stay ahead of the examiner expectations. So one of the kind of macro challenges we've seen in these discussions and conversations with really kind of the industry as a whole and just our customers is, first off, third-party risk management guidance has created it where the reviews have to be more in depth. So you need to start pulling things out like your user entity controls in addition to your findings. You need to have a way to document you're actually managing your user entity controls from those SOC reports. There are processes and expectations where they also want you to document your fourth party vendors. Now, interestingly, that information actually comes in as part of the SOC report. You can see that in the carve out section where they actually will do this documentation. But really what we're trying to do is create this, or the examiner expectations have now created a level of expanded expectations on third party risk management and your vendor review and risk assessment processes. Additionally, we're seeing the need for the user access reviews in both more depth and frequency. So they're wanting you to go through and review permissions for your critical applications. They're wanting you to know where the privileged access components reside, either in a group or really more granular in an employee level. They want you to be able to go make sure that you are terminating your users in a timely format and fashion, and be able to have reporting and documentation to validate that. I mentioned the PII assessment. They're also looking at this controls to match. So one of the dynamics that's really an overarching challenge as the regulatory expectations change is we've had this sunset of the cybersecurity assessment tool. And for those of you that maybe are jumping on for the first time, at FInosec, we've actually worked with the ICBA to create a cyber assessment specifically for community banking. But regardless of what assessment you went through, the controls have changed. So if you've used the FInosec CAT, or you use CIS or CRI or NIST, in any of those frameworks, what's ended up happening is your controls have changed, but they have to match your other risk assessments. So when you think about your information security risk assessment, or your IT risk assessment, or your vendor risk assessment, the things that you said yes to inside of your cyber assessment, those controls, you need to be able to make sure that you have the right ones associated in risk assessment. Creates another level of kind of complexity in how we think about how we match the data between those pieces. We're also seeing this trend of business continuity management, kind of resumption discussions, coordinating to vendor risk. And you really need to make sure that those two pieces are in alignment. So at the end of the day, what we're seeing is this trend of all of the components that you have for your exam kind of expectations are expanding in nature, and they're wanting you to make sure that you have validation and correlation between those processes. So going back to the PII assessment, when you're doing your vendor reviews, you need to understand, and your vendor risk assessments, you need to understand the PII assessment expectations. So there's some unique expectations that are creating challenges that we see. Now, the reasons why are really pretty clear. This is actually from the Verizon data breach for 2026. There's really a couple of critical things that we're seeing related to overarching breaches. So what Verizon does is they reviewed over 31,000 instances, and they really kind of correlate what are the trend data, and they do this every year. It's a really good tool and resource. You'll notice at the bottom of each of these, I've actually got a reference to the links to be able to go get additional information. So when you get the actual presentation that we'll send out to you, you'll actually be able to go in and look at the further details. So one of the big trends is we saw a significant increase in breaches involving a third party. So that went from 30% to 48%. So almost half of the breaches had a third party impact associated or was part of that risk. Vulnerability exploitation also increased. So this is the first time that's actually been number one from a vector standpoint. And really what the trend of those two pieces are that we're seeing is vulnerabilities at your third parties are causing a majority of the overarching breaches. So when I was talking before about the examiner expectations on fourth party risk, that's the meat and potatoes on why they're concerned on it. And the other one that just significantly spiked, right? And in this case, it roughly tripled from the previous kind of review and process is your employees using unapproved AI tools, this shadow AI. if we want to sound fancy. But think about your team members and how do they know what AIs to use? And do they know that what has to be approved? And how do we track it? This puts the expectations and shows you the trends of where the attacks are coming from. And then we're also seeing that critical vulnerabilities being fully patched is actually going the wrong way. And this is before kind of we factor in, because this is looking at the previous year's attacks. And this is before we have things, I think you call it mythos or mythos, but essentially, if you look at the vulnerability scanning tools that are out, Anthropic has been having a lot of conversations about exploitations. We clearly are expecting these things to continue to trend. So the overarching expectations of breaches and just what we're seeing in the in all of the industry are associated with these things. And that goes through with what we saw as major attacks over the last 12 months. So as a great example, if you're not familiar with this, again, I've got a link at the bottom where there's an American Banker article that talks about a community bank that was publicly traded. This is part of why we know the information. One of their employees used a shadow AI solution and uploaded customer information into that AI solution. They actually had to then go notify the regulators. They had to go notify their customers. Talk about the employee that you don't want to be, right? They were lucky in that they were actually able to get in touch with the AI solution. So the AI solution did not learn from the data that was uploaded. So they were actually able to protect the learning dynamic, because one of the dynamics you have in AI land is how does the AI unlearn something that it has? How do they go and take those pieces back? And that's a very significant challenge. So this expectation of that, where I was talking about the AI breach or the AI, shadow AI being an exposure, this is a great example of what we're seeing related to attacks, specifically in the community banks. Another great example is the Marquise breach. This one started as 70 institutions, expanded to 80. I think there's a whole conversation on why everyone didn't know this on the front end. There's a dynamic of kind of oversight associated. Again, and I've got another American Banker article in the bottom of this, but it was 824,000 customers were compromised. And the exposure was because the software company, Marquee Software, did not patch and keep their firewalls updated. And there was a VPN exposure that created this risk and exposure. So those patching and those vulnerabilities and the third-party risk and the dynamic of how that flows down to you as an institution, these are great examples of what's going on. Now, why I'm starting with all of this specifically around the regulatory expectations and the cyber attacks is giving you discussion and talking points for you to go take to your board, for you to be able to go explain to senior level leadership in a way, in a mechanism where it's not just hypothetical and it's not a whole bunch of technical components. So as you kind of think through your processes, part of what you want to be able to go explain is to your technology steering committee, to your executive team, and even to your board, here are the things that are going on from a regulatory standpoint. Here are the things that are going on from a cyber risk standpoint that we need to be aware of. Additionally, we're also seeing a trend with cyber insurance risk and really claims being denied. And there's some really interesting stats associated with this. So this traveler's claim being denied is a really good kind of use case. In this case, it's a precedent case. Essentially what happened was on the questionnaire for coverage, what ended up happening is the company, and it was not a financial institution, it was just a company, responded that they had MFA in place. Well, post ransomware and post breach, what happened with this group, and really we've seen this as a trend across the financial institution landscape, is when you have a breach and it's a significant dollar amount, the cyber company now is trying to figure out, how do I not pay out? This is Captain Obvious on the business side. Insurance companies make money by taking insurance in and paying out less than they take. One of the ways they do that is by protecting themselves from an exposure standpoint. That's why they do the questionnaire. And the stats on this are pretty staggering. The 28,555 cyber claims closed without payment versus 9,941 closed with payment. So the trend that we're seeing just at the highest level here is if you have a breach and you go to your cyber insurance, statistically, the payment is not always guaranteed. And the way that we're seeing the exposure is first this questionnaire for coverage. So one of the things that I would just encourage you to go look at is look at your questionnaire for coverage, see the attestation that you did, put yourself in a scenario where you have a major multi-million-dollar breach and your cyber insurance company comes back to you and says, you filled this out, prove to me how you're actually managing these things. The things that you've said yes to, you want to make sure that you can actually prove. If there are things on that you've said yes to that you're concerned on the documentation, you want to highlight that to your executive leadership and to your board and to your tech steering committee, because it gives you a way and a mechanism of being able to talk through, here's the business risk associated. We've also seen policy definitions be a significant challenge. One of the things that we see on the risk exposure is the verbiage in the cyber insurance policy giving protection to the cyber insurance company and potentially the community bank not realizing what exposure that they have set. So understanding the changes, understanding the definitions, those things are really critical. We've seen two specific examples. One is we're seeing AI exclusions becoming more and more prominent. We're also seeing this active war exclusion, and the active war is really interesting with what we have going on with Iran. And essentially, there's an out for the cyber insurance company in the event that an attack or a breach is created because of an active war exclusion. And I use these, one is just to give you some context on trends, but as you think about the non-technical leader at your institution, their process and understanding of this exposure is critical, because now this becomes a financial business decision on why we're investing in cybersecurity governance, or why we're investing in cybersecurity technologies, or in the governance and the oversight processes. It gives you some credibility and some ways to be able to articulate, hey, here are the challenges we all need to be aware of from a risk perspective. Now, at the same time, we've got AI governance and AI things going on. This is a phenomenal chart. This is the hype chart for AI from Gartner. And essentially, they're highlighting this initial use of AI and then this peak of these inflated expectations. Like, you just go on this journey. And some of you, as I go through this, everyone is going to be on a different spot on this chart. Your leadership team is going to be on a different place on this chart. And the processes that you have organizationally is also going to be the same. So what ends up happening is initially you see this, oh my gosh, this thing's going to be the best thing since sliced bread. Then all of a sudden there's this, wait, it's hallucinating. Wait, it's not right. And some of y'all are still on this curve going down, and you're not sure it's ever going to stop, and you're not sure AI is ever going to work. And then really what you see here is there's this trowel where basically you kind of hit rock bottom, and then there's a slight component that goes up from there. And the challenge with this is AI usage is expanding rapidly. AI governance is a significant challenge and expectation that we see across the board. In our conversations, we've really seen most institutions are just implementing policies. They may have rolled it out where they have the employees sign off as part of acceptable use, but the inventory and the risk assessment of AI governance is a gap and a challenge. I'm going to have at the end, we're going to have some links to this and some information. We're actually doing a AI governance webinar on best practices and really how we see a way to simplify that process on September 3rd. So be on the lookout for that from an educational standpoint. If you're joining us for the first time, also, hopefully, I'm putting a bow around the process and setting your expectations. We just want to help and really give you education that's related to the challenges that we're seeing. But this expectation is really critical to kind of understand of where we are on the trajectory, where your team is as part of that process as well. Now, the dynamics that we're seeing as challenges is really kind of several scenarios related to AI. The first is it's not just Copilot. It's not just if you're using OpenAI and ChatGPT or you're using Claude or maybe even Gemini. We see a lot of Microsoft Copilot because of the Active Directory thought process and expectation. But it's also your vendors, and your vendors are using AI at a rapid pace. I'm part of several banking technology user groups. I will tell you the acceleration on AI is really unlike anything I've seen in my entire career. And we're going to continue to see that. So one of the challenges we've seen is being able to have documentation of which vendors are using AI. And then where does the data go? Does the data go to the AI solution and it's learned forever? So there's really this data governance, data quality, the expectations of how you go manage the ability of the read-write components associated with the AI. And then really this overarching concept of how do we just have approvals on the configuration and documentation? Again, I've got a full hour AI governance webinar, and I'm just really hitting kind of the tip of the iceberg of the expectations and the challenges associated with AI governance. That goes back to the overarching risk. Now, at the same time, we have this staffing challenges, and specifically around independence. There are several quotes from the FFIC handbooks on information security, that information security should not report to IT or operations. It really needs to be separate, and there needs to be a clear path for that. It's a real challenge in community banking because, let's face it, everyone wears multiple hats, and how do we go do these things? And if I have one person that's really good at IT and information security, I don't have two people, and how do I go do these things? So what happens is somebody misses a meeting and now they're the information security officer, but now they don't have the expertise. And a lot of times what ends up happening is this kind of succession planning or this independence process creates kind of unique challenges in our space. And I think understanding the risk and exposure and then communicating, again, this to your executive team. At the same time, so if you're in information security, there's a side of this that maybe make you feel good, especially if you missed the meeting and you got the job responsibility. I love joking about that because literally that's what happens in community banking is when you're really good at getting stuff done, your team sees a challenge and you get a new job responsibility. You get this new hat. So some of the trends we're seeing on the information security job market, first off, there's a 29% expected growth rate on information security jobs between now and 2034. So significant increase on the expectations and growth. As of right now, the numbers associated, there are 4.8 million jobs in information security that are unfilled. So not only do we have unfilled jobs, but we have this massive growth. The typical tenure for information security is right around 4 years. And that creates some unique challenges when you think about how do we go and make sure I've got processes in place to make sure the institution has a plan associated. And then nearly 9 in 10 organizations who had a security event, so had a breach, had a process in the past year, they actually attributed at least one part of the impact was skill shortage. That's scary, right? When you think about, and that's a phenomenal statistic to be able to go back and tell your team that, hey, 9 in 10 organizations that have an attack actually attributed to a skills shortage associated. Now, I've got 2 links on the bottom. One is the Bureau of Labor Statistics. One is the ISC2 statistics that, again, reference these specific data points that you can go review and get more and additional information. But really kind of trending data associated with this is something to keep your arms around. And then we see the manual burden. And usually when I start having these conversations with community bankers, and we do several things and discussions in our world on really kind of trying to understand these manual tasks and labor intensive, we see repetitive tasks. You have to answer the same questions or assessments multiple times. So you've got the cybersecurity assessment and the controls associated. Then you have your ransomware self-assessment. Then you have your cyber insurance questionnaire for coverage. And then we have the Graham-Leach-Bliley attestation, and the list goes on. I could spend all day talking through these different pieces and the matches where you're really getting asked the same questions in different ways, but the questions in there are inherently kind of the same. Now there's this risk of, well, I said yes over here. Did I say yes over here and doesn't match? So this matching of data creates a burden and a level of detail in the minutia of your overarching information security program that really becomes a challenge. We also see this dynamic where, like I mentioned before, the PII assessment and the regulators come out with a new expectation, or you're sitting on a session, maybe it's even today, and you're like, gosh, I don't have a PII assessment. And you go and you Google PII assessment, or you go into Copilot and you go, can you give me a PII assessment? Or you open up your email and you send an email to all your buddies and maybe even your auditor and say, hey, anybody got a PII assessment? I don't know what this is. What are you guys seeing? But that time to figure out not only what to do, but to make sure you have it right when the examiners and the auditors comes also becomes a challenge. And ultimately, these become labor intensive and manual processes. As some great examples of manual processes, user access reviews and permissions on your banking applications. I mean, these are the type of reports that we get from our banking solutions, hundreds, if not thousands of pages where you need to know the codes and who has rights to what because of these codes. I joke a lot of times you need a master's in hieroglyphics to do the translation, or really these printouts should be on a green bar printer sitting in your operations center from like 1974. And the reason why we had that green bar printer, that green and white paper, is literally so you could go and read across as you went through your process and be able to go and say, oh yeah, I can see and I'm not losing my track. Extremely manual process. Well, now the regulators and the auditors are saying, you need to do that more frequently. You need to do that more in depth. Creates additional kind of labor challenges when you're going through your processes. And a lot of what we see is you may have tools for part of these things. You may have processes and dynamics, but a lot of times we still see spreadsheets. So when I mentioned that PII assessment, it's not uncommon when you go reach out to your buddies and all your peers in your email, and then you get a spreadsheet back. Well, now that spreadsheet has to then be a way and a mechanism for you to be able to go back and match things. And ultimately, these disparate processes, these disparate systems, and these dynamics of not having data live once really create a level of labor and process time that spreads the typical institution thin. So at this point, what I'm trying to highlight here is the staffing dynamics and just giving you some details to go talk to your team about on, hey, like, here's my challenge. I'm doing these things in just repetitive tasks. And a lot of times what we'll see is this gap between the team that's doing the information security work or the IT work and executive leadership. And there's a lot of discussion around how you go through process or the technical solutions that you use, and less around the actual challenge that you have. And we found when you are going through your board process and your communication to executive leadership, focusing in on the challenge is more important than how you do it or what the solution is. Getting buy-in on, I'm not okay with that, or we really should evaluate other options is the way that you're ultimately going to have the most success in what I would just call this creating the business case for your team. So as I kind of change gears, there's this other dynamic from a board and an executive leader standpoint. And they have a responsibility as you go through your budgeting process and the solutions that you have, is they should give you a credible challenge. They shouldn't just take what you have as a rubber stamp. Some of you are like, I know, believe me, that's not what I get at all. It's a real problem. but they also need to understand the process. So I've got some examples of some questions that your executive leaders, your IT steering committee, and even your board should be asking on this concept of the credible challenge. So the first one here is, what did you not get approved? And why? What's the exposure for that solution? So what you did not get approved, a lot of times what I see in the budgeting process and an exposure standpoint in this credible challenge is your team, Captain Obvious, does not have an unlimited budget. If you're in community banking, I know I am preaching to the choir. That is just part of the world that we live in today. Now, based on that, that means that you're not going to get everything approved. What this question does and what this conversation does is it allows for you to be able to go explain, I recommended this, we didn't approve it, and here's why we did not approve it. That conversation is super healthy. The other questions that your executive team should be asking are things like, how do we manage independence? What is our process for that? When you think about your manual processes, they should be asking questions and saying, what's labor intensive? What has a high likelihood of error because you're doing a manual process? I go back to those user access reviews, and for me, it would be like page 4. I would lose my capability of being attention to detail. I just don't have that strength at all. Maybe you're better than that. Maybe you can get to page 20 or 30, but can you get to page 100 or 600 as part of that review and feel like you're actually going through your process? This one's really good. You could tell your team, hey, I'm not going to play the lottery if you're the information security officer. But this conversation really is important to think through. What happens if you do play the lottery and you win? And you come in on Monday and you're like, hey, I won. I told you should have been on the pool with me and we would have been out walking out together, but you didn't do it. So I'm leaving. See you later. What happens inside your institution? The job market I talked about creates risk because information security is a very marketable job. That these things, I like using the ISO wins the lottery because it just kind of changes the conversation, and it's not a negative dynamic, right? It's not that they got a new job and a raise, but those things are going to happen based on those statistics that I was talking through earlier. Some additional questions: how do we protect against AI risk? How do we innovate at the same time? We, as a community bank, there's no doubt that AI is a game changer in your overall operation capability. I'm so excited about this. It's a leveler of the playing field. But how do we protect against the risk, and how do we do governance? How in depth are we managing our vendors and our systems and our access? And then ultimately, can we prove it, or just do we say we're doing it? And this really goes back to that cyber insurance questionnaire. And as I go through those things, really what you want to be able to go do is you want to be able to go empower your executive team where they know the answers to these. And ultimately, what the goal of this is not for you to get everything approved on your budget. That's not going to happen. Just very transparently, welcome to community banking. There are not enough dollars. There's going to be some things that you're going to have to do manually. There are going to have to be some things that you can't go and protect yourself against because there's not unlimited dollars associated. And it becomes this trade-off or this what's the risk versus the exposure conversation. But what your goal is, if you're the information security officer, is you want to make sure that your team understands and accepts the risk. What you don't want to have is that because of your budget process and you can't get things approved, they don't know what they're accepting as part of the risk. What your opportunity here is to change the conversation and say, in my role as the information security officer, I'm concerned, and here are the things I'm concerned about. I realize we don't have an unlimited budget, but I want to make sure we're on the same page of what risk we're accepting based on these scenarios. And what this does is it creates a way and a mechanism for you to be able to communicate in a business conversation. It's not the technical feature functionality. It's not talking about the flux capacitor and how fast you have to go back in time, right? If you kind of think, if you're catching my analogy, that's a good old dynamic of Back to the Future. And we tend to go really technical in the details, but this changes the conversation to a business. One of the greatest tools that I've seen, and I don't have enough time to really go as in depth as I would like to do on this, is actually knowing your audience and the discussion points. One of the things that I found has helped me tremendously in conversations and discussions and presentations is this concept of DISC. So DISC is a communication profile. So the communication profile is essentially a way and a mechanism where you can categorize your team into, are they D, are they I, are they S, or they're C? For those of you who maybe haven't heard of this, I just want to talk a little bit about the structure. So the first is dominant or dominance. Typically, these are going to be folks that are opinionated. They're going to be very much, when you get in a presentation, they're going to tell you what they think. They're not going to hold back. They're not going to wait. They're not going to be concerned on what they say hurting somebody's feelings. They're very direct in communication. On I, it's typically, these are the folks that they're your social butterflies. They want to be able to go and influence, and they're going to tell you everything that's going on. A lot of times what you'll see with an I is they're talking about their family and their discussions and their processes. And if you contrast that versus a D is talking about, what do we get done? Is it done? And maybe if you have time at the end of the day, they may talk a little bit about what's going on the personal front, but they're very much like, let's go get stuff done, very direct dynamic. So when I'm saying this, I want you to kind of think about your technology steering committee, your leadership team, your process for budget approval. Where does your team rely, or where do they stand? So for D's and for I's, they're typically going to be action oriented. That's the top part. They're typically also going to be very outgoing. They're going to be more extroverted. Now on the bottom side, you've got C's and S. So C's are conscientious. They have an attention to detail, and they want to be able to make sure that they got it 100% right, and they want to go through. They're also very they have this diplomacy dynamic. And then S's, these are the folks that are like, the team is the reason why we're able to go do things. They are team leaders, and this dynamic of listening to what you said, and I want to make sure I understand and I didn't miss something. They're going to be the ones that are quiet in the room, but you know that their questions they ask, they're listening to what everybody was saying and what that process is. So why am I talking about this when I'm talking about budget and just this conversation? Well, based on these types, you communicate and you give them things differently. I'll go in a very specific example. If somebody is a C and they want details, send them the details beforehand and let them review it. They're going to want to go in the depth and detail. Now, if they're a D, they're not going to want to read all the details. They're going to want the TLDR, too long, you don't have to read it. I feel like I'm so hip by using the abbreviation. Hopefully you get a chuckle out of that as I say that. But the dynamic, what they want is they want the bullet points. They don't want the details. So your presentation changes based on your audience and understanding. I would just encourage you to spend some time thinking about that process. Also, maybe even do a test, see where you stand. What bias are you going to have? Because you're going to present in the way that you would expect to present. So, if you're a C, you're going to present with a bunch of details because you're like, well, how do you not make a decision? You got to have all the details. If you're doing that to a D profile or even an I, they're checked out. They're like, oh my gosh, you sent me an email with way too many words. And if you're a C, you're like, well, I wanted to make sure you knew the obvious decision. It's so clear if you go do the research. So this understanding that we're all wired different in the way we make decisions and the way that we actually go through the understanding process is a silver lining in your process. Now, the piece that I like to think through, and I think this being prepared and being confident, I am a big believer that if you do the preparation for this process and you think through how am I going to present this and what are the things they really need to know and what are those dynamics, it builds a level of confidence for you. And I use this example, I've used this for years with my team and discussions, is let's just say you have a dog and you take your dog to the vet. Or maybe you get a major medical notification. And now all of a sudden you're sitting in front of the doctor or you're sitting at the vet, and that vet or that doctor is really nervous. Well, your dog's really got this issue and we need to do surgery and it's really expensive, but they're not confident in that delivery. What are you going to do? How are you going to respond? Are you going to be taking their feedback? Or are you going to go get a second opinion? The confidence dynamic and your preparation go hand in hand. So I just want to encourage you to leverage the things we've talked about today to create your communication plan on how you take this to your team. I've intentionally designed this presentation where you can send this to your team. We're going to have several blogs and content resources around these concepts as I've talked through today that we're going to be also able to share with you as we go forward. But ultimately, we want to be able to empower you to be able to have those conversations where, again, you don't get everything approved in the budget, but at least you're able to go talk about that process associated. So if I can kind of put a bow on this process on kind of the way we've seen this work is go back and talk through, here are the cyber risks. Again, you're going to be getting this presentation. You've got a couple of really good examples, both from the Verizon breach study and then those two institutions and the institution risk on AI and shadow AI, as well as the challenge associated with your third-party vendors. Highlight the third-party expectations, the authentication dynamics, the need for you going more in depth and this risk associated with the regulatory expectations. Go pull your cyber insurance questionnaire. Highlight and say, hey guys, we said yes here. Next time we do this, let's make sure we add more than just yes. That's another thing on just your cyber insurance process. But hey, I'm concerned on. And document your time, what you're doing manually. One of the things that we actually offer, if you want our assistance on this, and I know this is sometimes really frustrating. Sometimes if you have a company's logo on a document that you take to your team, it just is viewed differently. I know that's super frustrating when I say that, but it's real. So one of the things we do for free, both for customers and for prospects, is we can spend about an hour with you and do a manual assessment. We can have a conversation and document the things that you're doing that are acts of heroism and communicate it in a way and create a document that you can take to your team to be able to highlight. And like I mentioned earlier, if you're the information security officer, if you're responsible for cybersecurity budgeting and process, your job is to make sure that the bank knows what risk we're accepting. You're not going to get everything approved, but you want to make sure that they understand that process. So my goal today was really to create a framework and a process for you to be able to go through and communicate to them. There are several resources that we're going to have kind of post this. And ultimately, hopefully this presentation, if this is the first time that you joined us, kind of reiterates, and if this is the time, and if you've been on before, our heart as a company is we just want to help. And so as you go through, if you have questions, we'd be happy to walk alongside you. So we're going to give you a couple of things. You'll get a copy of the presentation. You're going to obviously get a recording of the presentation. Again, the design today is not just for the technical team, but for you to be able to send this to your technology steering committee, maybe even your board, to talk through processes and just the challenges and the risks associated. We're going to we have the ability of plugging in and helping you with the manual assessment. We're happy to have just a conversation around like, hey, here's our process. You can do it yourself if you wanted to go do that. We have the AI governance webinar coming up on September 3rd on best practices and really a simplification strategy to be able to go perform AI governance in a really simplified and focusing on the most important risk way. And then lastly, one of the things that we're doing is we do post-exam, we do interviews with our customers and really just the industry as a whole. And what we're able to now gather is documentation on trend data. So as we're going through that process, and just some examples of the conversation are things like, if you could go tell your peers what was different with your exam versus the last time, what would you say? When the examiners came, what were the things that they were really focused in on? What surprised you? And obviously several other conversations around that exam. What we're then doing is we're correlating all that data across the industry. And then if we get your exam date, we'll actually send you resources of these trends before your next exam. One of the things we know is a challenge is we know that you're getting examined at least every 18 months, sometimes more frequent, but for sure 18 months. And as part of that process, if you're a state bank that's FDIC or Federal Reserve, it could be 3 years since the state came, or it could be 3 years since the FDIC or the Federal Reserve came. And then the expectations are changing. So really what the design of that resource is to keep you abreast of those changes in those expectations. So we've got processes where our team will touch base with you to be able to kind of walk through these pieces and the processes and the discussion. And again, really what our hope is for you to be able to take the discussion and the process that we went through today and be able to go leverage this as you think about, how do I go manage this? How do I go create the business case? How do I have these conversations internally? So now I'm gonna go ahead and open it up for questions. I've got my contact information. If you're on LinkedIn, I'd love to connect with you there. That's a place that I like to try to kind of do social interaction and discussions. I've got my email address associated, but we have a few minutes left intentionally. If you're like me and maybe you have questions, I haven't seen anything that's hit the chat as we went through today. So that's either really good or really bad. Either I've completely done the Charlie Brown teacher and that wah, 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 wah. And you're like, oh my gosh, what am I listening to? I think I'm just going to go open up my email and do my email over here instead. Or maybe I was able to keep you entertained and getting the information and kind of put a bow on it. But I want to pause for just a second. I'm not great at not talking. You probably know that at this point, as you've been spending the last 50 minutes with me talking. But I want to give you enough time to be able to ask the questions and be in the process. If you have questions around the manual assessment or those exam trends, or you see an opportunity to be able to go through and use and leverage this for your team, obviously would love that feedback as well. But I'm going to go ahead and wait for the awkward silence. Oh my goodness, that's so hard for me to wait. I just want to talk. Super thankful that each of you spent some time with us today, and hope this was informative for you as you're kind of going through the journey and process. And if there are things that you have challenges with like this that we can help with, would love your feedback. If you have ideas on how I can be better presenter or walk alongside you in better ways, I'm always all ears on that. Again, the heart of FInosec and really how we lead and run the organization is all around this mission to help financial institutions and community bankers manage these things. So again, super thankful for your time. I'll give you a little bit of time back. We hadn't have any questions that came up, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week. Thanks so much. Cheers. See ya. Bye-bye.